So welcome everyone to Gems from the Wisdom Tradition. We're very honored to have one of our instructors at Still Moving Center, a very great yoga practitioner, David, who will speak on the topic of contentment. And with that, I will hand it over to David.
Well, it's been an interesting journey over the several days that I've had to think about this, but I think it's actually been something I've contemplated for a lifetime. It has. So for me, it's really been a lifetime process of finding that peace where I can. And contentment is, I think, sort of the end result of those moments when you can cultivate that state where all of the craziness disappears. I do have a short presentation I plan to give through a PowerPoint and then open it for discussion. A couple of definitions to get us rolling: the state or experience of being content, satisfied with what one has, not wanting for more or anything else. What I found in Wikipedia I thought was very good: optimal state of satisfaction. It can be seen as a mental state drawn from being at ease in one's situation, body, and mind. Some synonyms for contentment: equanimity, peacefulness, satisfied, fulfillment, serenity, ease, eudaimonia. And I would love to hear someone speak on Aristotle's notion of contentment and reason for this idea of eudaimonia. Antonyms, what it's not: dissatisfaction, disappointment, discomfort, upset, attachment, and aversion. So what I'd like to do is just a little meditation, get us, I'd like to start, maybe we just stand up for a moment, kind of shake out any tension, roll your shoulders, turn your head, notice your breathing. If there's anything out of order in your environment, quickly set that aside so it's not a distraction. And I had this idea about sort of feeling contentment in the body by feeling what discontentment felt like. And I thought about, what if you were just to reach your arm out? You know, how long while you're reaching for something before you become discontent? So contentment in the body feels like ease and comfort in the body. So with that in mind, go ahead and take a seat and do whatever it takes. I like to rock a little side to side and roll the shoulders up, back, and down. Maybe give the head a little wobble. Just be comfortable. Allow your eyes to close. And recall, or imagine you can recall, a time or a situation when you felt completely comfortable, at peace with where you were, who you were being, and recall or imagine how your body felt, how you were breathing, what you were wearing, anything else that you notice about this situation when you were completely comfortable and at ease. Do you notice any particular fragrance? Are there any special sounds or music? How easeful is the mind and thoughts? Are there a lot of thoughts or just a few? What sort of emotions are you feeling? A lot of emotions or just a few? Is there anyone there with you? How do you feel towards them, and how do they feel towards you? How grateful do you feel? Is there anything in particular that you are grateful for? How is your body feeling now? Are you smiling? How easy is your breathing? What else do you notice? So take a moment now to sense the space that you're currently in. And when you're ready, gently come back to the present moment and allow your eyes to softly open. Renee is also not present, but she asked me to speak on this topic specifically from the yoga of Patajali, and it's something that I have practiced. And she suggested that perhaps some people were not aware that yoga is more than what we commonly view as the exercise program that people know as yoga. And so I thought I would bring us back to this notion of contentment. I thought I would give a very brief presentation on the yoga of Patajali. So it dates 4,000 to 5,000 years, but it was first codified, written down by the sage Patajali just about 2,000 to 2,500 years ago. And this yoga is a system or a practice of self-discovery and self-transformation. And its purpose is to guide one on the journey to know one's true nature, which is how it's often referred to in the West. That essential self beyond the layers of the physical and the mental and the emotional selves, all the other selves. Beneath all of that, one might think of it as our spirit or soul. Often we call it true nature. In Patanjali's yoga, it's often described using the image of a tree with 8 limbs. And sometimes we think of it as growing upward. So some of these concepts are foundational, but really, if they're the branches of a tree, they're all essential at once to have the balance of a tree. So it's not that one of these stages precedes another. They really all occur in our lives in a somewhat a fluid way. And I'd like to speak to the first 2 of those limbs, of the 8 limbs of yoga, known as Ashtanga. And the first 2 limbs are often referred to as the ethical precepts, the moral principles, and they're referred to as the yamas and the niyamas. And so the yamas are 5 in number. They represent the moral restraints, what we should limit or eliminate from our thoughts and behaviors as a foundation for this growth towards knowing oneself, or the growth of consciousness. The 5 yamas are ahimsa, and any one of these could be a lifetime of study. I would say that Gandhi had pretty much wrapped his whole life around this practice, the very first of the yamas, non-harming. And as they say in the medical profession, first, do no harm. The second is satya, or being honest and truthful. Ashteya is non-stealing. Brahmacharya, honoring the self and others in relationships, or the notion of the right use of energy, not being wasteful. Aparigraha, or non-covetousness and not being greedy. So these are something that we try to restrain from our thoughts and our behaviors. The next 5, known as the niyamas, or those observances, thoughts and behaviors that one should aspire to elevate one's consciousness. The niyamas are satya, or purity of body and cleanliness. Santosha, humble and content in the modesty of how things are. The focus for our topic today. Tapas is the fire of transformation, it's commitment, it's enthusiasm. Svadhyaya is self-study, welcoming our limits as our teachers. And finally, one that's very difficult for me to pronounce, Ishvara Pradnyana, or letting go of ego and surrender to the divine. So these become the foundations, and as you can see, that Santosha is very central to the practice. I am going to also just mention a couple other things as I was looking at this topic of contentment. I found this quote from Siddhartha: health is the most precious gain, and contentment the greatest wealth. From John Stuart Mill, centuries later, he wrote, I have learned to seek my happiness by limiting my desires rather than attempting to satisfy them. Love that one. Marcus Aurelius, live with the gods, and he who does so constantly shows them that his soul is satisfied with what is assigned to them. And from one of my favorite books, Jonathan Livingston Seagull, Richard Bach said, perfect speed is being there. And I'm really feeling the connection between the idea of contentment and being in the flow, being in the now. And this is where I have heard many Buddhists speaking on the topic of contentment as being that lack of aversion from things or attraction towards things. And with that, I am going to turn it over to the circle.
Thank you so much, David. So I think one of the best ways to kind of start the conversation is, how do you personally feel content? Through any of those modalities that David might have speaked about. I think if we think of this year's theme of being truly human, one of the rewards in the many forms that we offer compassion and, caringness to everybody, is really kind of self-satisfying in a way. I know that right now, Still and Moving, every month, we have a beautiful sound healing that incorporates a yoga nidra practice. And it's very, very fulfilling to see how much, the Still and Moving Center community just is so eager to give back to, their own backyard, basically. All of those organizations that we partner with, for example, Halikipa or Hualanapua, they're right in Hawaii. And, through the practice of not only sound healing, but that yoga practice, it allows people to benefit in so many ways, not just learning something, but taking away that sense of fulfilling their duty of giving back, even if it's in a small way. And I think for me, just seeing that joy that is brought is remarkable. So,
first of all, I just want to say how grateful I am to Renee and to all of you guys who participate in this Gems of the Wisdom Traditions, because I find that it's very hard for me to find contentment at this time. I am uncomfortable. It's hot. I was running around this morning doing errands, and I find contentment actually in coming to this circle, because it allows me to let go of the other things and to concentrate on listening to somebody who can share wisdom. And through that, I am working towards attaining contentment. So thank you, David, and thank you, Kevin and Bob, and all of the other people who are on this circle. Mahalo.
I'm curious if anyone had a moment in the meditation or had some imagery from the meditation about the elements. I'm particularly interested in sort of what allows for contentment to arise, because it, like everything, it comes and goes. And so I'm curious about what we might distill from the circle as to what are the maybe precursors or ingredients that invite contentment to arise within.
Well, it was interesting as I heard you give the guided meditation, you said, go back to a time when you felt contentment. So I literally did that. I mean, I went back to my early childhood, a childhood I don't exactly remember, but a neighbor told me this was true. When I was quite small, I would crawl up on a big oil barrel in the back of our house. and I'd sit up there, my legs would be on it, and I would sing. She said I would just sing out, it wasn't any song. I would make up the words and everything. And as you were guiding the meditation, it felt like I was singing, and was anyone with me? And all the birds were with me, and they were not responding to me. They were accepting me, and I was disappearing, and so I have no eye experience of that, just that memory of sitting up there, singing to myself or to the world. And it strikes me that's part of contentment, of being in a condition where we're not so loaded with our own sense of ego. Meister Eckhart says, the eye with which I see God is the same eye that God uses to see me. There's an interesting kind of correlation of seeing through God's eye rather than our personal eye. Spinoza says, we see sub specie eternitatis, from the eye viewpoint of eternity rather than our own personal ego. And it struck me that's kind of what Buddhist koans are about. Shakyamuni passes the Dharma on to Mahakashapa. What does he pass on? How does that work? And at some point, they're both seeing through the same eye. In other words, Buddha's eye or God's will. And yet they're still Shakyamuni, they're still Mahakashapa, they're still the two people, but they're experiencing without that sense of self-identity. I'm kind of floating all around, but they all connect in some way. So I'll just leave it at that.
Thank you, Bob. I got that image, and I connected with that idea of where the you just disappeared, and there was just, I was thinking about that quote about the dancer from the dance. At some point, you disappear and you become the dance. In your case, you become the song and the present moment. Yeah, dissolution of self, I think, is a huge component of that notion of contentment.
Can I jump in here, David?
Please.
Okay. I'd like to echo Mary's mahalo for everybody. This is a wonderful series, and also echoing Bob Buss's experience of sitting on the oil barrel as a child and singing no particular song. That's wonderful. As I was going through the guided meditation, I was particularly drawn by what I understood to be, David, your introduction to this session by talking about PTSD. Am I correct? Was it
That's
PTSD?
correct.
I thought so. Yeah, and so there is some kind of therapeutic sense to contentment against the backdrop of this PTSD past. Okay, and that's very, very interesting, this therapeutic effect, or this place where contentment might have a proper place in a journey wrestling with some kind of condition, some kind of situation, and that was very interesting. That was drawing me like some kind of gravitational center, and I find that very refreshing. David, can you help me on that? Can you help me draw out some of the therapeutic implications or the therapeutic benefits of contentment? That would certainly help me. Would you please do that?
I can certainly take a stab at it from perhaps a neurobiological standpoint. PTSD is a condition of alertness. Um, so the lower part of the brain, the amygdala, which is, the guardian, if you will, to keep us safe. We're on alert for things that could be dangerous to us. And oftentimes it's more alert than the situation provides for. And there are some real downsides to this hyperactivity in the amygdala. There's a host of chemistry, brain chemistry, that produces hormones throughout the body that are fairly dangerous to the body, and they age us pretty quickly. We are in that state of fight or flight at inappropriate times. So back in the day when we had something, the bear would frighten us, then we would regulate into this sympathetic mode. Our limbs would become strong. We'd either climb a tree or chase that deer down and eat it, or run from the bear. So that chemistry is very necessary for our survival, but oftentimes just the screeching of a brake or a loud noise is not appropriate to be throwing the body into that state. So I see contentment really as sort of the antithesis to that sympathetic state of arousal. Some call it this parasympathetic response is to rest and digest, where we don't need our limbs to be climbing. When we're in that state, the body goes into healing mode. That's how we keep that balance. And so finding ways to bring contentment or peace into one's life, to dysregulate the amygdala and to bring us into a state of peace and calm. For me, it's something that I think by the age of about 25 is when I realized that for me, the end goal in this whole game of life was to be at peace, because it wasn't that way for some very formative years. So I find even still, after 50 years of meditation and yoga practice, that I am still on hyper alert most of the time. So it's an interesting topic for me to take on. Robin, does that begin to speak to your question?
Very, very much so. The question of contentment, I'm kind of getting to see in what you're saying, may have its context in situated in personal experiences and neural functions and such, and these contexts may change at a different time in one's life, and so the question of contentment and its place in the scheme of things seems to be very contextual, is what I'm hearing. And that's very interesting. So that it might well be a necessary part of a healing process in one context, and it might be the dissolution of what needs to be healed in another context. A little child sitting on a oil drum barrel, singing his heart out, no particular song, but just singing as the birds are singing. That's probably a different context where no healing is in sight. No therapeutic function seems to be there. There's just youthful exuberance, or in this innocence, crying out with all one's heart. That sounds like another kind of contentment there, both of which are, of course, I think wonderful. I think those are wonderful and seem to be quite different from each other. I don't know. What do you think, Bob?
Oh, I think I really agree with that. You know, it seems like peace of, when we say peace, the missing words are peace of mind. I mean, it's our mind that is discontent, generally speaking. Even if our body is off, it's how our mind relates to that being off. My knees hurt, I'm in agony. So it seems to me that, peace of mind can go in two directions. One is kind of sort of putting aside the pain, going to a place where, you're more centered, and therefore, you really are removing the pain. The other direction, which I think is more natural, at least to a Zen way of thinking, is to be attentive to what's out there, to really just accept things as they are. And that's a different kind of energy, true acceptance, living in God's will. However you want to put the metaphor, there's a certain kind of contentment in the world rather than protecting yourself from the world. So I would see those as two different things. And therapeutically, you may have to go through one to get to the other, but they are different directions. So I wouldn't want to go into one state and preclude the experience of the other state.
Bob, sorry, I just missed that second one. Could you summarize the two directions for me, please?
Well, I guess one would be, shutting off your experience of really, focusing on one point to the extent that nothing else exists. And then the other direction is being aware and accepting of everything. So those are, as I would see it, the two directions to a state of peace of mind.
Thank you. I just wanted to piggyback on that. I think we all know the bombshell Marilyn Monroe, and I did a very intensive research project on her psychologist, Dr. Greenson. And there was a lot of, critiquing about, did they have too close of a relationship? It was said that she would have dinner at his house. But one thing that I thought was really interesting is he had always told Marilyn, he's like, think of some place, maybe when you were a child, you used to go to your grandparents' house and that felt safe for you, or you went to, someplace that felt safe. And she was moved around so much in her childhood. And then, of course, stardom just took over. And I thought it was very interesting that techniques that might have worked for some patients really couldn't correlate to her situation. And it's funny, well, it's not funny, it's sad, but I think to Britney Spears, who rose to fame, she really had no sense of, what it was to be childlike or what it was growing up, because she was growing up in front of the public's eye. And I really think that's so interesting that in psychoanalysis, when, the physicians are saying, relate yourself to a safe place when you feel vulnerable or anxiety provoking. And it's so tragic that some people don't have that sense of contentment because of their past. And I just thought that was really interesting. And I think that nowadays, obviously, there's other forms of treatment for PTSD, not so much going to that happy place or the content place, but through EDMR or, anything like that, we've really advanced to really focus on people's mental clarity and mental health. And I just am so grateful to that, because so many people suffer. They always say you don't know what's happening behind closed doors or what's going on in people's lives. And I just think that kindness always prevails, and that truly does help people to at least feel content with you if you're providing that. So
Thanks, Kevin. There were a couple of things that came up for me while I was asking myself the same questions that I was asking in the meditation. There's a couple of things I've noticed. I like to get extra groceries and hand them off to people on the streets. And in those moments of giving, there's a sense that I think is very much related to contentment. It is a very contented feeling when I'm in that place of giving and sharing. So there's that sense. There's also times in nature. I find that nature, standing beside one of the giant redwoods, the filtered light of the woods, just being in nature and the purity of nature is so calming for me physically, mentally, and then emotionally. And this is kind of a lead in. I just wanted to bounce this back to Bob for a moment, because you said that the missing piece in that was peace of mind. But as I dove into this subject for the last few days, I was kind of grappling with the mind and thoughts versus emotions and feelings. So peace of heart somehow came to mind, as well as the contentment is more of an emotion, or is it a lack of emotion? Is it much like, is it a lack of thoughts? Is it this dissolution of all of that when the little me disappears and I become the I? Thoughts?
It strikes me as very interesting that the Chinese word is called Xin, is the heart and the mind. It's the heart-mind, or the mind-heart. In other words, as they were looking at it and naming the world, to have a thought without feeling was impossible. It didn't make any sense. And to have a feeling that somehow wasn't also a thought didn't make any sense to them. So the heart-mind is an interesting starting place. And then, of course, you look at how balanced that heart-mind experience is. As you were describing the experience in nature, there's a certain kind of harmony, and really, your thoughts and feelings are probably much more diffuse, rather than, sitting in meditation for 3 hours and suddenly feeling your back and your knees hurting, or, your mind going through a series of stories that you're telling yourself in meditation, so, it's that kind of thing. But I think it's interesting that heart-mind could be seen as one thing. And then the question is, healthy or unhealthy?
Yeah, brilliant. You've mentioned that in previous talks, and I love when you bring that back to us. And I was thinking of someone, a very dear friend, who tends to be a bit anxious, and I'm thinking that there may be some idea that when we have thoughts that are not connected to our heart, that are not connected to the emotion, that may be what you're talking about, is that balance. Is if our emotional component is constrained in some way, that's not a whole thing. And that's, I think, the anxious thoughts that are not being expressed through emotions. I have this feeling that there's some sort of, because they watch with the fMRI technology, they're able to see that when you introduce a thought, that signals travel down to this part of the body, that ignites and does all sorts of wonderful things, and then messages are sent back up to this part, and then more messages are sent down into the body. So there's this process where the heart and the mind are connecting, and then I'm wondering if there's something blocking that connection down to here. That may be when people are going nutty in their thought process.
Well, it's interesting that Plato, in thinking, and again, I'm kind of thinking of the difference between an Asian way of thinking and a Western way of thinking. In Plato, we have the metaphor of the charioteer, and we have a black horse and a white horse. The white horse are our emotions, our passions, and the black horse is our will and our, energy going. And then they have to be guided by the reins of reason. So the head controls those other things. And control of the heart-mind would be an odd way of putting it. But control of our passions by our reason is a very natural Western way of putting it. And suddenly we're separating things that maybe aren't that separate or wouldn't have to be separate.
Yeah, I did stumble upon Aristotle's notion that contentment comes from a life lived with reason. And I think that's along those same thoughts.
In Western thought, the heart and mind was a single concept till about like 500 BC, and with the emphasis from Aristotle, from what I read, his emphasis on the sense of purpose of things that Western thought took after Aristotle for a while. There's some trace of it in the words like diaphragm or phren, PHREN, or phrenology, the study of the head. It all has to do with the midsection of the body and not the top of the head.
My swim coach has been telling me about this 17-year-old Romanian who just broke the world record for the 100-meter swim. And at 17, he hasn't even really filled out. He doesn't have kind of the body that you would expect. And so it's got the whole swimming world trying to figure out how did this happen. And in an interview with him, the interviewer said, "I understand that the coach has been coaching you on the philosophy of Stoicism." And I thought, well, that's very interesting. How does Stoicism relate to sports? So it did get me to thinking, because I heard the interview while I was also thinking about the idea of contentment. So I looked and found that quote from Marcus Aurelius. And this got me thinking that contentment. So what this swimmer says is he, for the first 50 meters, is just doing his swim. He's just in his swim in the moment, not competing. And for the second 50, he's reserved all of this energy, and he just like lets it loose. And you can see in the second half of the race, he just blows past everybody else. And he doesn't have a body that you'd expect that to happen with. And I'm curious about how the coach has now been, working with his mind. He was seen to be, when the other swimmers are showing up onto their platforms and they're being named, he's applauding everyone as they come along. And his whole approach to his craft is very different. And so I'm thinking, when you're competing, you are really outside of yourself. So the notion of his sort of Stoic approach is he's just doing his swim. He's very much present in the moment, this moment, right here, right now. Whereas in a state of competition, you are outside of yourself. So I'm curious how this all might bounce off somebody else's mind and heart mind.
The Stoics have an interesting kind of ideal. The word that summarizes their philosophy is ataraxia. And they basically said that, if you feel like a spike of happiness, then you're going to have to experience the opposite. And so it's almost like taking drugs. You get a high, but then you go down. And then you need more drugs to get higher, to get to the same point at one point. So he's saying, they're saying ataraxia is an even keel rather than the spikes of happiness, sadness, anger, love, whatever experiences you're putting at the peaks. You're saying, a certain leveling is important. I don't know if that relates to anything, but you can see it negatively affecting. Yeah, I'm not sure how it experiences in terms of philosophy of life, but that sense of contentment or calmness or level experience rather than the peaks of say competition or the anxiety of winning, losing. It's interesting when you mentioned that giving was such an important part of your experience. The paramita of dana means to give something with no expectation of receiving anything, or with no expectation that any good will come of it. You don't, you just give, and that's it. You have no expectations of what's going to happen. You don't know what's going to happen, but you just give without any expectation.
Going back to the meditation of when I thought I was, where I felt content, was very interesting because it took me back to the completion of one of our hula events on Kauai a number of years ago. We'd finished our performance. We came down the mountain. We were at the Waimea Plantation Cottages, which is just a peaceful, beautiful area. And everybody kind of went their own way. And I was sitting on the lanai, just feeling, okay, we accomplished something. And that was a very contented time because I felt like, okay, we accomplished something. It was a beautiful thing. Everybody participated. We were able to share. And so I can relate also that to when you give, because you're doing something good. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Mary. The part that really keyed in for me on that was you said you had done good. And one of the things that keeps circling back around in the back of my head in all of this relates to this yogic idea of the true nature. And the true nature is giving. The true nature is good. It's benevolence. And so that I think this practice, when we give, it gets us more in touch with that deepest part of ourselves. And it's why we feel that, wow, we've done good. And I think that brings us closer in touch with our true nature than, when we're struggling through traffic or trying to, earn a living, or all the things that might draw us away from that sense of our true nature. So I think some of these yamas and niyamas are about just guiding us to what was really essentially true. Some of the synonyms for contentment often mention joy and happiness. And I think we can be content without having those. But I think, though, that joy and happiness are maybe bedfellows with this idea of contentment. Some that joy and happiness can arise in the place of contentment. Robin, any other thoughts on these lines?
Now, I hesitate a bit, but now that you ask, let me mention what's going on in my mind. David, in your initial talk, you also talked about that part. You talked about stages of, I forgot the terms, but dissolution of ego, in which when ego falls away, there is something else to attain. And going with that rough framework, I'm thinking that contentment belongs to the ego. And when the ego is let go of, there's no such thing as contentment or satisfaction of what one desires and what is good versus bad. There's more of a non-dualistic, I would imagine, a non-dualistic attainment in which the relative emotions of, conflict versus peace, or bad versus good, or those kinds of relative things no longer play anymore. And so I'm thinking that in an odd sense, perhaps, this is why I hesitate, to mention, because it might be that contentment also can hold one back from that dissolution of self. Well, I guess I said, I hope I don't cause too much trouble in saying that, but there might be this too much success in contentment that holds us down to this point of not letting go of the ego, not letting go of the emotions and the feelings of fulfillment and self-satisfaction that attend the ego.
I'm right there with you. And it's why I mentioned the idea that I think contentment doesn't necessarily contain joy and happiness. It seems more, for me, contentment is when it's all gone. And there is that, what Bob mentioned about this, just that the I disappears and there is just this presence, the presence of oneness, which, I have experienced through meditation and through the use of plant medicine. But yeah, it's not necessarily felt as a thought or as an emotion. All of that simply dissolves, and there is just.
Oh, can I fill in something at this point? There is just, and this is personal. So I want to say there is just joy. How's that?
Yeah. Language is a funny thing. I think, as Robin says, you could just say, I have joy. I have peace of mind, heart. I have affinity. I have empathy. I have like-mindedness. In other words, I'm connected rather than separate. And maybe that's what joy is.
That makes sense. But can I just say that, and here's slightly going on the edge here, but it might be that everything else besides joy that you mentioned might be dualistic. It might be relativistic, relative to each other. Joy, however, needs no opposite to be what it is. Peace might need an opposite to be peace, or, liking might need an opposite to be liking and such. But joy needs no opposite, I believe. Happiness might need an opposite to be happiness, and satisfaction might need an opposite, or something to be satisfied to be content. But joy, no, I don't think so. So I'm thinking that when the self falls away, what remains is not contentment, but joy.
Yeah, what I take from that, Robin, is that the word that you have, because I think this state that we're all trying to point at or get a grasp on is something that is beyond language itself. It is that your choice of the word for that non-dual state is joy. And if I hear joy from that place, then I understand your joy.
Okay, good. Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, we are just at the top of the hour. I just wanted to thank everybody for carving out some time.
Hear, hear. I think we all want to shout out thanks. Mary did right at the outset. And I think that Mary's mahalo is echoed by each and every one of us. Yeah. Thank you very much, David. That was very informative, insightful, thought-provoking, and comforting.
I share those thoughts exactly.
I thought so. Thought we all did.
Yeah, I felt that everyone's participation was an acknowledgement of that, and I feel quite acknowledged and grateful and thankful for everyone participating. And Kevin, thank you so much. Mary, everyone who listened in, Truth for contributing. Blessings to you all.